Welcome to Nerdology, where we dive into the science behind consumer behavior, sensory research, and the latest hot topics in behavioral science. Quick insights, expert reviews, and conference highlights, all in bite-sized form. Let's get nerdy. Welcome to another episode of Nerdology, the podcast where we explore the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and consumer research. I'm your host, Michelle Nigella, and today we're diving into the controversial topic of facial coding in consumer research, particularly why it's flawed based on the work of renowned neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett and her theory of constructive emotion. If you're not familiar, facial coding is a method used in consumer research and it stems from psychology to infer emotional responses by analyzing facial expressions. The idea is that when we see a smile, it means happiness, or a frown means sadness. But here's the issue. The science just doesn't back this up, especially when you dig into the theory of constructed emotion. Lisa Feldman Barrett's work really challenges the traditional view that emotions are hardwired and universally expressed through specific facial expressions. According to the theory of constructed emotion, emotions aren't simple reactions that are universally triggered. Instead, our brains actually construct emotions in real time using sensory input, past experiences, and cultural context. This means that emotions are fluid, complex, and not always tied to the same facial movements across situations or across people. Now let's dive into one of Barrett's key papers on this, titled Emotional Expressions Reconsidered: Challenges to Inferring Emotion from Human Facial Movements, published in 2019 in Psychological Science in the Public Interest. In this paper, Barrett and her colleagues argue that it's a huge oversimplification to assume that facial expressions reliably convey specific emotions. Sure, people may sometimes smile when they're happy or frown when they're sad, but this is not a universal rule. In fact, the way people express emotions on their faces can vary dramatically depending on the cultural context or the specific situation and even individual differences that we all have. What's more, similar facial movements like a scowl can be associated with different emotions or even non-emotional states like concentration or confusion. The paper stresses that while facial movements are important for social communication, they don't provide a one-size-fits-all key to understanding emotion. And if you think about it, this creates serious issues for consumer research that relies on facial coding. If the same facial expression can mean different things in different contexts, how can we reliably infer what a consumer is feeling just by looking at their face? Another interesting study from 2021, published in Nature, titled Professional Actors Demonstrate Variability, Not Stereotypical Expressions, when portraying emotional states in photographs, adds even more complexity to this issue. In this study, professional actors were asked to portray emotional states in response to detailed scenarios, and their facial expressions were then analyzed. What Lisa Feldman Barrett and colleagues found was fascinating. There wasn't a consistent stereotypical facial expression for emotions like anger, sadness, or even happiness. Instead, actors used a variety of facial configurations to convey their emotions, and the participants who rated the photos had different interpretations depending on whether they were shown just the faces or given some sort of context about those scenarios. This variability suggests that facial expressions, even when posed by professionals, aren't as straightforward as we think or we hope. The key takeaway here: emotions are context sensitive, and our brains use much more than just facial movements to figure out how someone is feeling. So, where does this leave us when talking about consumer research? Well, it certainly raises some big flags about relying on facial coding to measure emotional response. If emotional expressions aren't universal and depend heavily on context, then we really need to rethink how we're measuring consumer emotions. Facial coding might give us some information. As I always say, it's not the fault of the tool, but rather the fault of the human that's trying to interpret the results. But it's incomplete at best and misleading at worst. Instead, we need to focus on more holistic approaches that consider context, cultural differences, and a broader range of behavioral and physiological data. So, Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, particularly on the theory of constructed emotion, shows us that emotions are not simple, predictable reactions that we can easily decode from someone's face. Consumer researchers need to move beyond these outdated ways of thinking and models and embrace the complexity of humans and human emotion. Only then can we truly understand how consumers feel and, more importantly, why they feel that way. So, thanks for tuning in this episode of Nerdology. And if you enjoyed today's discussion, be sure to subscribe and check out other episodes where we break down the latest in neuroscience and consumer research. So, stay nerdy, my friends.